Three. Okay, please, you first.
Usually in the media, we saw that Russia justified its intervention in Crimea to protect the people there from fascists that were supported by Americans. To what extent is it true or false?
Okay, any particular speakers? You're asking your question to. Okay.
I'll say something about.
Shall we get the other questions?
Yeah, sure.
Please,
two more questions.
This sort of reminds me a little bit about World War II, like Germany taking the Rhineland, and the way they just sort of did it, and then everyone just let it happen, and no one sort of said we'll do it through official channels. It just sort of happened. Do you think this could be, if we don't act now, this could be something that gets worse every time we push it off, because eventually it just culminates into something that gets as bad as it will get?
Arjun?
Yeah, mine's similar to that. Is Putin's Russia's occupation of the Crimea and Putin's justification, could it be seen as Obama's Munich? And the related one was, could you elaborate on why it was that the Crimea was transferred to the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic initially?
Thank you. Kyril, would you like to answer?
Okay, I'll cover some ground and then you chip in. Now, the first question about Putin's claim about protecting people in the Crimea. Two issues there, as far as I'm concerned. The first thing is that after the revolution happened in Kiev, and it is worth bearing in mind this was a very sort of Kiev-centric revolution. It was centered on the capital, and much of the country was watching on television what was happening and being alternatively fascinated or horrified. So things that happened even before the revolution, but also after that, had a particular resonance in Crimea. What the Crimeans saw is, first, there was a big group of Berkut policemen that were fighting, I mean literally fighting, with, say, the right sector or other parts of the Maidan self-defense groups in Kiev. So some of these people came back in coffins, and other people came maimed and whatever. Then this Berkut was seen as heroes by many in Crimea and many in eastern Ukraine. And this is one quite a strange thing, is like the people that half of Ukraine sees as murderers, the other half sees as heroes. It goes back to what we've been talking about, the divisions in Ukraine. So in Crimea, these people were seen as heroes who have been sold out by Yanukovych. Yanukovych was seen as a coward, irredeemable coward, and then things that started coming from Kiev were flashing warning lights for people in Crimea. There were repeated calls or claims by the right sector that they will send a friendship train to Kiev, and all these titushki, as they call them, is like sort of collaborators, or I don't know how to translate it. It's actually a new word in the Russian or and Ukrainian language that has emerged over the last year from the name of one particular individual. I don't want to go down that road, but these were not fantasies. The right sector did not reach Crimea because there were these self-defense groups that started forming spontaneously. Similar self-defense groups started forming in Donetsk and Odessa and whatever. The right sector, however, reached Odessa, reached Donetsk, reached Kharkov. It shot dead 2 people in Kharkov when demonstrators surrounded its headquarters. The right sector is a very, very peculiar thing. I mean, think of the child soldiers of Africa. These are quite often 14, 15, 16-year-old individuals that cannot be, that are not of age and cannot be tried in court and all that. These are people that have been taken in camps, have been educated, one can call them that education or brainwashing or whatever, and being taught extreme violence. These 14, 15, 16 years old. It's quite striking when you see them coming out, these same people with the masks and all that quite often are children. And these children are capable of maiming and killing, and have been taught to do that. So these people did not reach Crimea, but make no mistake about this. If Crimea has not revolted, if Putin has not got there, the right sector would have been in Crimea now, as it is in Donetsk, as it is in Odessa. So this is not a fantasy. What is probably more of a fantasy is to claim that the Ukrainian government is a fascist government. It isn't. There has a very strong neo-fascist element in it, but the government as such is not fascist. The problem is not so much that there is a fascist government in Ukraine. The problem is that there is increasing anarchy in Ukraine. And that's the worst thing that is happening. I've talked about the 89, 90 revolutions. I think a very good comparison with what's happening in Ukraine is Ukraine nowadays looks very much like Ukraine in 1917, the freest country in the world, and one we all know how it ended. After the first Russian Revolution came the other Russian revolutions or whatever, or civil wars, and extermination, and you name it. So there is a lot of freedom in Ukraine, there is a lot of violence, there is a complete breakdown of law and order in much of Ukraine. And that's the most scary thing. So the Crimeans did not want that. And they were seeing it already happening. It has happened in parts of Western Ukraine before that. So that's the justification for the Crimeans. And I want to emphasize that the Crimeans have revolted quite spontaneously. What is very telling is that for 3 days, Russian state television did not cover the pro-Russian demonstrations in Crimea. They have not been given the go-ahead by the authorities to actually cover them, because the authorities didn't quite know what to do. They haven't decided. And only after 3 days, they started covering them. And the Russian Revolution in Crimea was on the verge of defeat when Putin intervened, because there was a rally trying to take over the parliament building in Simferopol, and the Tatars have overpowered this rally. The Tatars are pro-Ukrainian, and prevented these the Russian rebels to take over Simferopol. They have already taken Sevastopol. Sevastopol is quite a different story. They started in Sevastopol, they took over, they appointed their people's mayor, much like has happened in parts of Western Ukraine before that. The funny thing now, well, funny in a way, is that Eastern Ukrainians are copying very much Western Ukrainians. So all the same tactics. So you take over a local government building, you appoint your own people, you take the other people to repent publicly. This has been done for months in Western Ukraine and has been done a few times in Eastern Ukraine. So it's not a fantasy, but it is not quite as it has come out about the threats to Crimea.
Would you like to touch the others?
Yeah. Okay. Now the Rhineland comparison. I actually disagree with this. I think we can talk about this. I think all these comparisons about Putin with Hitler don't bear any close examination. For one simple reason: Hitler was an expansionist at heart. He had particular vision. I'm not saying that he sort of. If you read My Struggle, then you it's A, B, C that he followed. No, it wasn't like that. But he wanted some sort of expansion. That was Putin is a reactionary. He sort of reacts to things, and he's quite conservative in this. He could be compared with Stalin more profitably. That would be my comparison. Not being a sort of a schizophrenic mass murderer like Stalin, being quite different individual in this respect, presiding over a very different society, but in terms of foreign policy reaction, what he did in Crimea is quite similar to what has happened with Western Ukraine and Western Belarus in 1939. So yes, quite similar. But basically, Putin was, and the Russian elite was quite committed to sovereignty. They were wedded to sovereignty, to kind of inviolability of borders. But they thought increasingly, from starting with former Yugoslavia, that the West actually is not playing by the book. Putin said as much. And for Putin, he was quite sincere in saying, in Ukraine, the West has crossed a red line for Russia. And he reacted to that. Basically, he reacted in a very peculiar. Anyone who's done Russian history knows what happens in this way. When the Russians decided that the other guys have thrown the book, not following the book, they completely throw the book out, and then he would do in 1 month something that took like 8 years for Western powers to do in Kosovo, like from occupation to independence. Putin did it in like 2 weeks or 1 month, depending how you interpret it. It's exactly what has happened with Stalin. Stalin was wedded to the League of Nations, ally of France, ally of the United Kingdom. Munich was a wake-up call for Kim, and then he said, well, if you don't bother, why should I? And he hasn't bothered. I mean, he went from bad to worse 1939, annexation of parts of Poland, subversion of Baltic states, war against Finland. So I think Putin is of that kind of reactive thing. But I don't think he's an expansionist. He's newly discovered Russian nationalism, that's the other thing. One of the reasons people in eastern Ukraine have been, in a way, resigned to being part of Ukraine and in many ways committed to Ukraine is because they have felt repeatedly betrayed by Putin and by Russia. Because Putin and Russia have basically washed their hands off. Any Russian nationalist in former Soviet countries knows how often the Russian state has washed their hands off Russian nationalists. And the biggest number of people that are in prison in Putin's Russia are not liberal Democrats, they're actually Russian nationalists. This is the biggest number of people that, you don't hear much about that, but they're the biggest number of people in prison, and so it's quite a curious situation. The people that have actually are in power in Crimea would ordinarily be in prison in Russia for being extreme Russian nationalists. Yeah, so I think on the Munich, I think I've pretty much answered that. So.
Was there justified risk for the Russian population in Crimea? No, there wasn't. And I don't think there would have been. I mean, I understand the psychological panic Kyril explained. I understand that. But I don't think there was an actual risk for the safety of those Russian people living in Crimea. As I said, annexation of Crimea wasn't a liberation. It shouldn't be seen as a liberation. It was, but the opportunity provided by the events in Kiev and by the Western reactions, or rather by the reactions which completely disregarded the international norms and our understanding. So Putin used this opportunity because the Russian state now under Putin, they cannot afford losing Crimea for military reasons, for political reasons, and for cultural reasons, for historical reasons, for symbolic reasons. Crimea is really, really significant for Russia, for Russian Navy, also economically as well. So for that reason, they saw the opportunity and they used it. I mean, and it was an imperial step, just like the other steps happening, initiated by the West since 2004. So they responded in the same way. So in that sense, of course, it's not something justifiable, or it's not something one can say, yes, this is they should have done. But I understand why they did this, because unfortunately the events in Kiev and the complete breakdown of all the norms provided the opportunity to Putin, which he used effectively. And again, I agree with Kyril in the general point that all this disregarding all kind of norms and using the violence so freely is very dangerous, very, very risky. And this is not, and many people already expressed this. I think I remember recently reading one ex-British ambassador in Russia, his commentary in Chetimov's website. I don't remember his name, but he was in Russia for a number of years, and in his commentary he was saying exact same. He was saying that the most important thing for now to do is, and the West should put pressure on the actual de facto government in Kiev to do this. They should take all the steps just to provide as much security and safety as possible to those people in the eastern and southern Ukraine who consider themselves part of Russian culture and Russian political entity. So this should be their priority. they should concentrate and then they should provide every kind of conditions and change the law or introduce new laws just to show those people that they will not be in risk. Because this is the biggest risk for the unity of the state. And I think also recently Timothy Garton Ash said more or less the same thing in his article on Ukraine. He criticized the violence, he criticized the Western governments for disregarding any kind of norms and accepting that violence and accepting that regime which emerged de facto from violence without questioning. And he was saying exact same thing. I mean, if you want to correct the situation, we must put all the pressure on the people in Kiev just to provide a legitimate and safe and balanced regime for all citizens of Ukraine, not only for those people who supported the movement against Yanukovych.
Yeah, well, the one thing we haven't responded to yet is this question about Crimea being transferred in the 1950s. I mean, I suppose the answer is we don't really know. But of course, Khrushchev was very committed to decentralisation and making decentralisation work. And I've heard the argument made, which is probably the most convincing explanation, that actually because Crimea doesn't have any land borders with the Russian Republic as was, it's only the only connections are with Ukraine, that actually his intention was to was that this would be a move which would help from the point of view of the further development of Crimea. I mean, of course, there are all sorts of other rumours like, oh, he was drunk when he did it, and the Supreme Soviet just took 2 hours, and so on. But I think that's just the kind of fluff, really. It does seem to me to be consistent with the sort of direction that Khrushchev was going. Of course, Putin's still lying about it. Putin said in his speech that the transfer from Russia to the Ukraine was a decision made in clear violation of the constitutional norms that existed even then. I'm sorry, I'm not aware what constitutional norms he was referring to certainly there was well, I mean, I suppose if you took the 1936 Stalin Constitution seriously and you said that, well, of course, there was a legitimate right of the Union republics in the USSR to secede from the country. Presumably, you know, that's what he's referring to. I don't know, but
could I chip in on that?
Yeah,
I think,
sure.
Yeah, I think. I mean, the decision. I think if one looks at how Khrushchev approached the economy and the state, is for him the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine made perfect economic sense, because there was the canal that transferred water from the Dnieper to Crimea, and it's sort of 80% of Crimea's water comes from Ukraine, from Dnieper in Ukraine, and electricity comes from there. It did make economic sense. It not having border with Russia is may have been important, but Kaliningrad, of course, also doesn't have border with Russia in its state to this day. Her state. So I think it was mostly economic reasons, but also it was meant to be a symbolic thing. It was given to Ukraine as a symbolic gift to celebrate the 300 years anniversary of the accession of the Ukrainians to the Russian state. So of course the Russians now can say, well, it was given to you as a gift because you were one state with us, and now you don't want to be one state with us. Why should you keep the gift? I mean, this is not a legal argument or anything. This is like a sort of a pub argument, if you will. Nothing more than that. Concerning the procedure, I think the argument is a touch more sophisticated than that. Is like I think they have, when Crimea was transferred from the Russian Federation to Ukraine, they should have gone through certain motions, and they didn't go through all these motions. Now, of course, this is not the only case in the Soviet Union where they have not gone through all the motions. Most of these constitutions, all these constitutions and norms were basically a charade and just there to be in the books, but it is true that they did not go through these motions, and for that reason, Crimea has been claimed by the Russian Federation, one part of the former Soviet Union that has been consistently claimed in the 1990s by different parts of the elite in the Russian Federation. So Crimea is a peculiar place, and perhaps the only real sore point of that has been for Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Let's take 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3. Next. You first.
I would just like to ask all the speakers, what does the notion of promised or agreement really mean in foreign policy? Just touching upon the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which established guaranteed political territorial sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention by Russia, United States, and the United Kingdom as well, in the exchange of removing nuclear weapons from Ukrainian territory. And for NRL undergrad student, what does for me mean a notion of promise or agreement in foreign policy today?
Second question.
Yeah, I have been thinking about the kind of Western response. We could have done with the fourth panelist trying to explain US and European foreign policy on this issue, because I'm much more worried about the Western response than about the Putin response, or even the Ukrainian response to Putin. And that's simply because I have the feeling always that we used to have something we call the military-industrial complex. We now call it the financial security complex, and it's a complex always in search of some action. And we've had quite a lot of action. I mean, you know, as you all know, I mean, there's hardly been a period without a war somewhere in which Western troops have been involved, and so I would be very concerned about some of the utterances that have come from Western governments, and also the fact that there's clearly a split, some kind of divergence at least, in the way in which they want to deal with the issue. And it seems to me that the further away geographically they are from the border, wherever that is now, the worse it gets. And with the Germans seemingly having a much more kind of sensible approach to all of this, and wanting to involve everybody in negotiations. So I was wondering, you know, where the West goes here, and what is the West, and what are the interests of the West in all of this?
What is the West? And the third question.
Yes, the gentleman there largely puts a lot of my points more eloquently, but building onto that, I was just going to ask, given Estonia's history with sort of bronze statue and things that moved in 2007, excuse me, do you feel there could be any kind of sort of tensions or anything rising in that region? Because obviously Estonia and Latvia have quite significant Russian populations. I remember, Kyril, that you said they were quite undecided as to whether to show these kind of local populations doing pro-Russian protests. If some kind of event like this were to happen again, do you feel that there would be any case, although I appreciate it's a part of NATO, do you think there would be any case of, say, a Russian enclave or a Russian republic being sort of more formally recognised in Estonia and Latvia?
Would you like to start again?
Right, I'll start with the last thing on Estonia and Latvia. I think at the moment there is absolutely no danger for either Estonia or Latvia. It's just the way Putin operates. He operates where he senses weakness, and as far as the Baltic states goes, he knows pretty well that they're covered by Article 5, and you name it. There is, of course, a big question whether the Americans would really fight for the Baltic states, but there is at least ambiguity. On the other hand, on Ukraine, there is no ambiguity. The Americans have said quite clearly they would not fight for Ukraine. So the Baltic states are in completely different, occupy a completely different place. It's another issue altogether whether it was wise to extend NATO membership to the Baltic states. We can probably discuss that for a few hours, but at the moment there is no point of discussing. They are parts of NATO. Now, whatever NATO means these days is a big if, a big question. It is certainly not what NATO was before 1989. But I don't think there is any danger in the foreseeable future of anything happening there. Another thing that puts the Baltic states, especially Latvia and Estonia, in a very different league from Ukraine is that they're not, they're not as divided as Ukraine is. There is no these, in the Baltic states you can't find these fluid categories, who is Russian, who is Ukrainian. It's very stark. In Estonia in particular you can visibly see who is Russian and who is Estonian. They dress differently, they look different. Not so in Latvia. Latvia is a much more relaxed and sort of an easygoing place than Estonia, but in Estonia it's very, very stark. Who is Russian and who is not. And of course in Ukraine it is not stark at all. It's like you take any leader of the right sector and you can transpose him in Moscow and he can walk freely and talk freely. No one would know he's not Russian. So I don't think any much danger for these countries. Of course, if things go downwards, this downward spiral that comes to this question about what's happening in the future, I think it is extremely worrisome what's happening at the moment, because when these things have been happening in the past, there is always someone who negotiates. I mean, think of Sarkozy going to Moscow, going to Tbilisi, sort of shuttle diplomacy, and actually coming with something. I think what is particularly striking is that there is no Western effort along these lines. It is shocking in a way. And I think Kissinger was, I can't say it, to be honest. I mean, Kissinger and even Brzezinski have been pointing in that direction, that it needs to be negotiated. And what is happening is, I think, for me the most striking thing is how actually anti-Putin Germany is at the moment. And there has been a really big breakdown of relations between Putin and Merkel personally, it seems, but also between the German political class and the Russian political class. Much more that comes on the surface. Now they have been mutually disappointed in each other, if you see that thing. So, but that is also extremely dangerous. I think Putin is talking his lines, and Western politicians are talking their lines, and I don't find that convincing or conducive to any compromise emerging. They're coming close on certain issues, but that's about it. It's like the foreign minister Steinmeier went to Donetsk, for example. He met the oligarch that is being appointed by the new Kiev government and professed himself satisfied that he's doing all the right things. No, he's not. He's not doing the right things. But of course he would claim that he's doing the right things. Because if you negotiate with just these people, these politicians, there is bubbling dissatisfaction just below the surface and in the social networks in Donbass and all that. And it seems Western politicians are not noticing that. They are negotiating with politicians, basically. How Russia is not doing this is another matter. But I don't see a Sarkozy making the rounds, and I think this is extremely worrying because there could be further escalation. I think Putin feels that he's up against the wall, and now his dilemma in many ways is: should he occupy the whole of Ukraine? Is it worth it? Should he occupy part of Ukraine? Because there have been noises from the Ukrainian elite that they will reacquire nuclear weapons. That's a red rag to Putin, this requirement of nuclear weapons. There has been noises about blowing up the gas pipelines that comes from the right sector, and all these things. These are all red rags. And knowing how Putin operates, he reacts to these noises in a particular way. So, and coming to the Budapest Memorandum, I think, unfortunately, it was soothing words to basically make Ukraine give the nuclear weapons, and it was not worth much. That's my reading of it. So I think probably at the time the Ukrainians knew that they were nothing more than just soothing words. They did not amount to a security guarantee. That's my reading of it.
Well, these former Soviet parts of former Soviet Union, these new independent states, came to be known as Russia's near abroad because of the significant Russian minorities. I mean, many Russians left for Russian Federation since 1991, but still almost every single state has significant Russian minorities. It's not only Ukraine, as we spoke, the Baltic states, Kazakhstan, all Central Asian states, even Azerbaijan, Armenia, they still have Russian minorities. And the rulers of those countries, they are aware of this. And they know that if they want to keep their country together, if they want not to provoke their still powerful big neighbor to threaten them and to cause some trouble in their country, they need to be really, really careful in terms of constitutionally and the treatment of the minorities. And there's a line, you shouldn't cross that line unless you want to take the risk. And in the Ukraine, this line was crossed. And this line started to be blurred since 2004. I mean, with Yushchenko, then Timoshenko, then Yanukovych came and pushed the line the other way. And now with the recent events in Kiev, the participation and all those really violent speeches against the Russians, which emerge all over the world. I mean, on our TV screens, we were seeing people saying really, really extreme things, which you may hear the similar things in Nazi Germany against the Russians. Of course, I mean, this is crossing the line, obviously. I mean, they crossed the line. And that's why it's a very dangerous, very risky situation. Of course, this doesn't justify what Russia is doing in Crimea or what Russia may be doing next in eastern Ukraine. But by crossing that line was very irresponsible, very, very dangerous, very risky. So the Russia's near abroad safety and security of the last 20 years relied on that sensitive balance, obeyed and put in place by the rulers of the new independent states. Everybody is aware of this. It was really silly, if not too naive, for the new leaders of Kiev crossing that line, even though they changed it, but banning the Russian language or changing the law, putting Russian language at a much lower status, that was completely unnecessary. That was an obvious provocation, a really childish provocation. And in relation to what Peter mentioned, the Western situation, and probably kind of your mentioned Budapest Memorandum, 15 years ago this week, all that line was crossed as well. 15 years ago this week, Kosovo, around Kosovo, Yugoslav Federation was being bombed heavily. That was the heaviest ever bombing in Europe since the Second World War. And then in Kosovo there was a self-declared regime emerge, a referendum, just again self-declared referendum, very similar to what happened in Crimea. And all Western countries immediately, they recognized this, they acknowledged this. Where was the memorandum? The border of the state suddenly changed. And no one said anything against it except Russia and a few other pro-Russian countries. All the West, they acknowledged that.
Well, Ukraine actually was dead against the. Ukraine was very much opposed to NATO's incursion into Kosovo. Can I just say, sorry?
No, let's go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly on the impact of these events on our daily lives. I think there will be a lot of unfortunate fallout. It's like I was listening to Prime Minister Cameron talking about how important fracking has become for all of us because of Gazprom. You can't rely on the Russian gas and all that. So we have to frack ourselves to extinction to prove our point on that. I think there will be plenty of other points. I mean, people in Germany that have been interested in nuclear power are basically saying to Merkel, well, you've seen the light at last, but why why are you phasing out nuclear power in Germany? And this issue may still be revisited. There are all kinds of little bits and bobs that would be affecting, unfortunately, would be affecting our daily life. So, in a way, we all need some sort of workable compromise and de-escalation, which is a favorite word, which is being preached about, but not much in practice.
Yeah, I don't know where to start really, but I mean, first of all, I'd just like to say that I really reject the comparison with Kosovo. It does seem to me that there's something fundamentally different in dealing with a movement for national self-determination in a situation which is fundamentally an imperial one from an armed land grab. I'll stop there. The Western response. I mean, I mean, you do hear a few kind of East European politicians, Peter, kind of talking up the, Ukraine should be part of NATO, kind of these horrible Russians. You can't. I mean, that's obviously they're playing to their own domestic crowds, isn't it? And so on. But I don't know. I don't really see that the general response that I've seen has been that level of provocation. I mean, it seems to me that when the initial response was a kind of set of sanctions. I mean, the list of people on the first list who were being denied visas and having assets frozen and so on. I mean, these were just, there was only one person on there who mattered. I mean, the rest of them were just kind of appointees who kind of have no real role in the political system. It was kind of real sort of window dressing. We must be seen to be doing something, but we're not actually going to do something that damages any of you at all, and now behave. Of course, the second list after the annexation of Crimea is quite different, and I think that because after all, this is driving a coach and horses through the UN Charter. I really armed. You don't settle territorial disputes by force. Is a fundamental. Well, as I say, it depends where you think the causes of that were, and I know we profoundly disagree on that. And I don't, and we're not here to discuss Kosovo. So,
you're right.
and when we're looking at Iraq, we're looking at the foreign policy of the Bush administration, which is not. And that period when the neocons had a certain world view, we might not be at that point at the moment. Now, I mean, going back to the point about the second list, I mean, here what we have is a sort of direct attempt to. I mean, it really goes for the people who are the closest ones to put. I mean, these people who've been many of the people on that second list of sanctions. I mean, these are the people who've enabled Putin to steal, kind of as more than anybody else in the country. This is the Timchenko who runs the Gunvor oil oil trading business. I mean, the rumours are that this is, or say the rumours. I mean, the State Department actually said that they had evidence that this was that this was. I don't know, shown us the evidence,
you believe that?
Well,
I think there's rumours again.
Yeah, well, possibly, but I mean, bankruptcy and the other. I mean, Arkady Rothenberg and these people. These are these are the people who are kind of, you know, holding Putin's wealth for him. And by the way, you know, if we're going into comparative palaces, you know, Putin's got considerably more than any of the political elites. So, you know, we're dealing with a similar kind of regime,
Yeah.
which is a fundamentally parasitic one.
They're not his property. They're state palaces. In Putin's case, Poroshenko has a White House as a
I
private
think we shouldn't
property.
be in a position of choosing which one of these berries we support.
I'm really kind of considering the policy, you know.
I think private property and using state property is quite different. I mean, probably it's best not to go down that path.
Okay. I mean, I think the more sober, you know, the more there is a kind of. It seems to me there is some kind of a consensus that you have to there is a need to kind of address the way in which the Ukrainian government is actually behaving. But at the same time, I mean, if you're going to kind of sort out Ukrainian politics in any way, you've got to move to a system where there is a politics which has some kind of basis of legitimacy. So through, you know, presumably an election which is held in a reasonably free kind of a way, and that Russia's security concerns have to be met in some kind of because there are legitimate interests, and so I you know, I don't know that I see it as kind of completely unwise, but.
I just like one more thing, you know, again in relation to Peter's point. I mean, you said what are the West is doing, not the governments, not the companies. I just read this week in various American newspapers a number of multinational American companies in the food farming sector. This was one of the first things the new de facto government in Kiev did. They signed huge amount of money value agreements in terms of developing and marketing land farming sector of Ukraine. And this is not surprising because Ukraine's land farming sector is one of the largest in the world. I think 7th or 6th largest land farming sector in the world. And Ukraine is, for instance, the 2nd largest egg producer in the world. And even CIA, in the website, CIA ranks Ukraine 2nd only to Russia as the most economically important component of the post-Soviet lands. So that's why even before any government attempted to do anything from the West, the companies, corporations, they knew. They were in Kiev and they signed the agreements. So this was probably the initial economic incentive provided to the new de facto government in Kiev. So they are hoping that they will use the Ukrainian sector and get huge profits in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah. Last 3 questions. 1, 2, 3. Okay, please you.
If we're thinking about division in Ukraine between this West and East, between these 2 nations, so first, is it possible? And second, how the West would survive politically and economically, even though they would feel the European integration criteria.
Although to an extent you have been trying to avoid the comparisons, the annexation or whatever you call it, liberation or whatever of Crimea might have very dire consequences from a geopolitical point of view beyond the fact that we're going to have fracking. So can I ask you to make a comparison as general as you can between that, Kosovo and the Falklands? Because yes, the Argentinians attacked, but they were put in a position where they had to attack. So it was a referendum that led to similar things. So that's my question.
Thank you. The 3rd question.
My question concerns about the progress of Putin. It's been said here many times that he's more or less reacting to things. But on the other hand, we do have Putin 3.0, which could have been could be there only because of the change of the law and things like that. So my question is that might have that been like planned during the 90s time, during the Yeltsin time, or am I just sort of like dreaming?
Okay, thank you.
With you again to start.
Well, the East-West divide. I think one has to put things in perspective. I have emphasized these two nations and things. And when one is making a particular argument, obviously one marshals arguments to support this particular line. And now I'll make some contrary sort of arguments. It's like Matthew also mentioned, this is surprisingly Ukraine actually, there is a lot of commitment, both East and West, to Ukraine staying a single state. That's quite an interesting thing. The divide is there, but there is also commitment. Some of the most important leaders, a few of them from the Party of Regions, not top guys and not oligarchs, who are more respected leaders of what we can call Russian Ukraine. They have been quite vocal that Ukraine has to stay together, and you can see why. Because I witnessed one of them in a discussion with some Russian politicians, and this Ukrainian Russian politician was sticking out because he took an independent line rather than parroting what was supposed to be the Putin line at the moment. And in a way, it's very sad if Ukraine disintegrates. I mean, apart from the tragedy on the ground, it's actually before these whole things, Ukraine was a fairly relaxed and pleasant place, much more pleasant place to live than Russia. And many Russians accepted that. It was a freer place with all the corruption, of course, and a poorer place than Russia. But many of the Russians actually quite like that. And many Russians, and sort of surprisingly, there have been lots of ethnic Russians that have been very vocally supporting Ukraine, and lots of ethnic Ukrainians that have been vocally supporting a pro-Russian line. So it's not simple how things will divide. It's neither so simple sort of East and West. It's very hard to divide. It's much harder than former Yugoslavia, where the Croats and the Serbs were more clearly delineated. And sometimes there is a generational difference. Lots of young people look towards Europe, whether they're Russian or Ukrainians. Lots of old people look east, older people. I think this commitment to the Lenin status is pretty much a generational thing. Lots of middle-aged and younger politicians in the Russian sector are looking further back to Catherine the Great and Potemkin, and not for nothing their monuments that have been destroyed by the Bolsheviks have been built up, and much to the displeasure of Ukrainian nationalists. Ukrainian nationalists have vocally protested every rebuilt monument of Catherine the Great, for example, or Potemkin, for that matter. But this is where the future divide would be, much more than Lenin. I think Lenin is, sort of top Russian Ukrainian politicians don't speak about that because they don't want to be disenfranchised by their own supporters. But privately they speak to doubts. Paradoxically, perhaps Ukrainian nationalists should be much more grateful to Lenin, because these borders that Ukraine has at the moment towards the east are due to Lenin, and of course the borders they have in the west are due to Stalin. These are the two greatest Ukrainians, if you take that particular line. But of course Ukrainian nationalists don't see it that way for God knows what reason. So yeah, I think there is a lot of staying power for Ukraine, east, west. But the divide is very real, and the way Western politicians have been approaching this divide I find deeply unsatisfactory. Because basically they say what they mean by pressuring the government in Kiev. They basically go there and say, you should do this. And then Yatsenyuk makes a statement in Russian saying making all the right noises. He has zero credibility. He has actually spoken against every single thing he said a week ago. He has spoken repeatedly against. This is on record. His statement has zero credibility. It has credibility with Timothy Garton-Ash and with The Guardian and with Western politicians. It has zero credibility on the ground. And this is what worries me, because no one wants, neither East or West, no one wants Ukraine to disintegrate into Eastern or Western Ukrainian states or nations, yet we unfortunately are moving along these lines, and it will be extremely messy if it happens, and I hope it never happens.
I completely agree with Kyril. I think that will be the worst ending of this crisis. And also there is no need, as I said in my presentation, it's completely out of dated, this nation-state idea. We don't need any more nation-states. We don't need any more divisions. I mean, when the states are coming together to create a Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukrainian states, will be both in short term and long term will be disasters for the people living there, for the countries in the region, and for the world in general. But I again agree with Kyril as well. Most of the Western leaders are behaving very irresponsibly in relation to this, which relates to what you said about Falkland. I mean, a number of people mentioned this and made this comparison, what happened in Falkland by Argentinian junta, by providing the provocation. They invited the British intervention, and then the referendum happened. There are so many examples. Like, I mean, to me, I still think that Kosovo is another example. But in the recent past, I mean, you don't even need to go that back to Falkland. I mean, from I don't know, from 2003 Gulf War in Iraq onwards, there are a number of occasions which was against law internationally and nationally, and Western states justified their actions by sometimes false evidence. And now we know that the evidence in Iraq presented to us, to British people, to British Parliament, was completely false and fabricated and distorted. But a war happened, a regime change, there was no justification for this, but all these incidents are important simply because whatever the United States spokeswoman in the UN said recently about Crimea, no one can take her seriously. I mean, she was talking about, oh, this is illegal, this is against the law. Which law? I mean, which law exactly? And which one of these incidents in the last 10, 15 years was legal, was according to any law? I mean, when you cross the line, then you are giving your right to the other side. I mean, they cross the line, they keep crossing the line all the time. I mean, in 2004, I mean, what was happening in 2004? All these things were written and published in the books, in the newspapers daily, and including George W. Bush's father was in Kiev. And a large number of American NGOs, including Endowment Foundation, established branches in Kiev and started giving millions of dollars to people and to train them in the civil disobedience. All those individuals, we knew their names even from Vietnam campaign. They were taken to Kiev to train the young university students how to organize public protests against the regime. I mean, all these were published by New York Times, by Guardian, by Times. So every single of them were crossing the line. After doing all this, how can they dare to criticize the other side being illegal? I think this is not a matter of legality or illegality, because no one has any right to claim anything on that. It's a matter of geopolitics. It's a matter of geopolitical interests and competition.
Can I just say something very quickly on? I think what is part of the problem is also a deeply entrenched sort of Western attitude that if someone breaks a rule other than us, we sanction them and we preach against them. And this goes back to the Middle Ages, if you want. You can call it a Crusader mentality, you can call it a God knows what, you can call it a Puritan mentality of the sort of preaching, the Americans preaching about human rights and sort of respect for nations. Say Wilson, with one hand, preaching self-determination somewhere else, but not in Latin America, for example. But this is very deeply entrenched, and it goes not just for the Americans, it goes for the Germans also. The Germans can become particularly sanctimonious because they do not even see themselves as a nation state. And they think that Putin is inhabiting another world, as Merkel said. Why so? Because the Germans don't think along these lines, so he must be, well, I mean, China is probably inhabiting another world also, but for the time being it is not being sanctioned. Or whatever. I think this, if we imagine that Russia, for all the outrage it was feeling concerning Iraq, concerning Kosovo, it has slapped sanctions on Western countries. it had exactly the same rationale, exactly the same reasons to slap sanctions down on Western countries. It didn't. The Russians just don't think along these lines. But Western politicians do. I think there is a fundamental divide in this respect. I mean, for good or bad.
I don't think we've addressed the question about Putin. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? I wasn't sure exactly what you were.
Let me clarify it. I was thinking that because there's been changes in law and everything, so that he could be on the third third season and everything. Could we see Crimea as a sort of like a part of bigger plan, which is planned already, like earlier?
Yeah.
Or
was this, is this strategy or tactics?
Yes, strategy of the bigger time.
Yeah.
Will there be like Putin 4, 5, or even 6?
Yeah, no, well, I suppose what I was trying to argue was that this, is consistent with the particular set of the kind of political problems that he's got in terms of he's found himself, because he's relying on a much narrower base of support, which is a much more conservative, that sort of conservative nationalist element within Russia, whereas the 1.0 and 2.0 were actually including people who very much wanted Russia to be, as I said, part of the international community, on its own terms and so forth. But the mindset of the people who are the supporters, who are the kind of base of this now, both within the Kremlin and in the country, is people whose view of the world is actually. I heard that the KGB mentality. Described very nicely as people who see the world as a life and death struggle with imaginary enemies. Although I think obviously some people around this table kind of really don't see this as imaginary, but I think that's where we differ. So I think. So where does that lead us in the future? I actually think that the kind of base of the Putin regime is pretty unstable at the moment. Actually, I think that the actual success was because of the economic achievements in the early part of his presidency. Because for a number of reasons, and I mean it's not just all but I think that this kind of decision is going to make Russian economic development a lot more difficult, and I don't think there's any potential left in the Putin regime to make the kind of changes to the Russian economy that are actually needed in order for there to be some sort of alternative source of growth and development to simply basing your economy on raw materials and flogging arms, which is where we are at the moment. So that's why it seems to me that the move to the kind of much more assertive, aggressive nationalist politics. It was a kind of inexorable result of Russian domestic developments. But I think there are two points about that. One, are there major sections of the elite within Russia who are going to be horrified by this? I mean, apparently Lebedev, the media magnate who owns The Independent and The Evening Standard, who's very interesting interview 2 or 3 weeks ago. He said the oligarchs he knows were ashen when they heard about the news of the Crimea, because it so much threatens their interests. So there's a division. Of course, the technocrats know that Russia needs. Russia has been for the past 2 decades involved in the whole sort of the financial flows and trade trade agreements, all this kind of, all this is threatened. So that those people are written off. As for ordinary Russians, I think it's not. We're not in a situation which is like the Soviet Union, because actually quite a lot of ordinary Russians have got used to the idea of being able to take foreign holidays or have access to goods which were previously unavailable. You know, in fact, that's what's been so good about Putin. So there are many kind of domestic forces which are actually which might actually be which might so I think Putin 3.0 is not how should I finish this metaphor? It's not an upgrade. It's a bit like Windows Vista. You know, it's not a good upgrade. But I think that Putin 4.0 would be more like Windows 8 and an utter catastrophe. You know, so I'll stop there.
So we're looking forward to Putin 0.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
On this thing, just two words on that. It's like what you mentioned, the conservative element. There are actually people, not immediately around Putin, but in sort of second echelon, like Glazov or something.
Yeah.
There are people who are actually very pleased with the sanctions, and they want more sanctions. For example, they have argued that it will be great. It will be great if Russia is kicked out of the World Trade Organization,
Yes.
because they want a reversal. They want to revert to a more statist organization of society. In a way, they want to kind of imitate what they see was China, a much stronger state, expropriate the oligarchs, and sort of revive state sponsorship of science and all these things, sort of undo lots of the liberal reforms that Putin has actually continued.
So they are putting pressure on Obama.
No, they're not. But they're making this notice on the more specific issue of was Crimea planned. Dmitry Trenin from the Carnegie Endowment in Moscow, who is a very bright guy, speculated, and we only can have speculation. He speculated that the Russian military had a contingency plan to occupy Crimea in case Ukraine suddenly joins NATO or something, and they dusted it off and acted on it. So it was so meticulously planned and all these things. They didn't quite have further plans, it seems, on other parts of Ukraine, and but we can never know. But I think having contingency plans is what every good state or good army does. That doesn't mean that Crimea was planned. I think if Ukrainian authorities had done certain things that they might have done, Crimea would still be part of Ukraine.
Thanks very much.